Hello, movie lovers. Welcome home. My name is Amy Hinsterling, and you are listening to Watch This List. This is a very special episode of PROVOCAUTEUR, in which we will be talking about a director that maybe most people would not consider provocative. But now that I've watched almost his entire filmography in the past 2 weeks, I can definitely say that he is. It's just in a very unique and special way. And there is no one else I would have rather recorded this with than Mitch, who has written extensively, I think, on Malick in a way that you haven't for other directors, Mitch. I feel like this is one that's near your heart anyway, on Letterboxd.
Yes and no. I'm very skittish to write about, and don't know if I ever will write about something like The Tree of Life. But yeah, I did. I've written 3. Come to think of it.
Your Badlands one was just so in depth because you were talking about all the different films. It wasn't just about that.
It was the last narrative a film of his that I saw. So I completed. I felt like I was interacting with his entire filmography at that point, as we're going to do now. And by the way, you've got the wrong guy, but I'm happy to be the wrong guy.
You know what I was going to say? Not that you're the wrong guy. You are the right guy, but I actually had a dream last night that when we recorded today, we opened it up with like the voiceover, like our best attempt at what's this? What is it? Like, what's this war in the heart of nature? And just like tried to do our best attempt because, I mean, that is like the common thread between them all is the voiceover gets more and more existential as it goes on.
Yeah, I'm glad we dodged it.
Yeah. You have the voice for it, though. I think you could pull it
funny.
off.
Yeah, maybe. No, I don't think so.
Certainly better than Ben Affleck.
And that was supposed to be Bale, too, wasn't it? I think.
What was?
The Ben Affleck role.
It was supposed to be who?
Christian Bale, I think.
Was it?
I think so. It wasn't originally Ben. I do know that.
I think he did an okay job. I mean, he didn't have to do a lot of talking. It was just sort of, movement and
at the time
caresses.
when To the Wonder came out, I was not excited about his being cast because at the time I was somewhat cool towards him. Although the same with Sean Penn and The Tree of Life, but I've become more forgiving of both performances. I guess as you must do as you grow older, become more forgiving of all things.
Hopefully. Well, I think what I liked about Penn being in Tree of Life is that since I watched these chronologically, I'd just seen him in Thin Red Line.
Yeah.
And then, so it made a little bit more sense. Whereas when it first came out, I was like, why is Sean Penn in this? And it seemed more random.
Can you tell me the order that you originally saw and which were rewatches? I mean, which were first time
Oh, yeah,
watches?
right. Okay, so Badlands I have on Criterion and I love it. That's been like a favorite film.
The first
And
one you saw?
The first one I saw was Badlands, yes. And then I had never seen Days of Heaven until this time. I had never seen Thin Red Line until last week. And then New World I had seen, Tree of Life I'd seen To the Wonder, not Knight of Cups, or Song to Song, and then I'd seen A Hidden Life. But I haven't seen The Voyage of Time. I don't know if you have. That's the only one I
watched it last night.
Did you?
Yeah. So
okay.
The New World you saw before Tree of Life?
Yes.
Okay. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
No, I saw Tree of Life first. I rented it at Redbox. Do you use Redbox?
Yeah, I used to.
They're out of business now.
Well, I'm sure people don't use DVDs, right? It's just all.
Yeah, I know, but I feel bad. They're actually selling them, I think. And I would love to get one and just stuff it full of somebody's Criterions. Because you could put whatever you wanted.
I used to use Redbox. I even was in the time where Netflix mailed DVDs to my house.
Yeah. I never used that service, but I do remember that. But I fell in love with Redbox because it was 24/7. I like vending machines anyway. It's just a weird kind of aesthetic. Just always there, always out there. But I got it at Redbox because a friend of mine said that I had to see it. And he was somebody in our small town of about 8,000 who stumbled upon Ebert when he was helping his mother clean houses and just found a big stack of newspapers and got into Ebert and got into movies. And he would always show me more offbeat stuff. But anyway, he said I had to see this, and I got it, and it was a house full of people that were going to watch it, and it just filtered everybody in the room. But I had like a spiritual experience with it. I got a stool and moved it up to the TV, which was a very small TV above the fireplace. And so I had that kind of looking up experience with it. And just, I felt, I'm going to probably use a lot of religious terminology by default because of Malick, but it was like a spirit filled kind of experience that I'd never seen anything like it. I'd never had that deep of a connection with anything. But I could see, I mean, did you think when you watched Badlands, you know, it's more of a conventional kind of film in a way?
Yes. And it doesn't feel as personal. It seems removed to me. It seems like you're listening to a book adaptation that's just very infused with literary devices and tone. So it doesn't have that sort of wistful, mystical feel to it as the other ones do, in my opinion, because it's so structured and it's kind of plot driven.
Yeah, it is plot driven. I really wonder what I would have thought about it if I had watched it first.
I thought it was amazing. Well, I had never seen anything like that as far as the cinematography. And then growing up, I loved Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, and I watched it all over and over. So anything that had like the lovers on the run, doomed young love thing really, really worked for me, because I basically had memorized the entire play because I had it on tape and I would listen to it every night.
Romeo and Juliet?
Yes, I did. The Baz Luhrmann film. I had, okay, Mitch, I don't know. You know the talk boy from Home Alone 2?
The talk boy.
The thing that Kevin McAllister uses to like record.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I had a talk girl, and so I held the talk girl in front of the TV and recorded Romeo and Juliet onto a cassette tape front and back. I think I used two tapes.
Incredible.
And I listen to it when I go to sleep.
I love that. I just watched that movie for the first time recently. My wife screened it for me.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah, it is. So the lovers on the run. Well, that's it. Maybe it just seems like it has more of a narrative structure. I mean, I guess if Malick's going to trick anybody into believing that he's created a conventional narrative, it's going to be through the road movie kind of format, because
right.
You're going in a straight line, so to speak, but you're going to point A to point B, but still very meandering and very, he takes a lot of liberties.
Yeah, and I don't know that, it's one of those movies, I don't know if you agree, but I feel like the narration does not actually help us know them. They're largely mysteries to me as people, the central characters.
Yeah, so when they allude to the fact that it might be her journal that gets out of the whole time. And if so, when I was growing up, I did try to start journaling in a very normative fashion. Here's the date, here's what happened. But as time went by, I became more and more paranoid that, someone would read this. And so you shroud it more and more with just ambiguous language. And eventually it's just poetry that nobody understands in the world. It's kind of like what it was. She was just riffing poetically about her circumstances. Yeah.
It feels very tragic romantic also. Like you can tell she's 15, or like the adolescent nature, but it's kind of beautiful in that way because it is Shakespearean in the sense of like the obsessive nature of the feelings and how overwhelming they are, and how it just like completely overtakes her ability to have any kind of judgment about the morality of the situation.
Yeah, maybe you can only believe in your own drama that much when you're that age, the Romeo and Juliet being youngsters as well. And
right.
And just the ability to suspend all kinds of belief in consequences, especially, and to put you your significant other at the center of all things. It's a very childlike ability,
Except
super
for when
ability.
Lynch did it with Wild at Heart, I think.
I haven't seen
There's
that one.
Oh, okay. That's quite a ride. That's another road trip sort of structure too. But that's very. I think Lynch borrowed a lot of Wizard of Oz stuff, but it's definitely like the lovers on the run. I can't live without you. I love you so much. Like who cares about anything else? Sort of vibe, and it does look different when it's adults. I will say than what you're talking about. So maybe there is something to that of like almost Arrested Development in that way, if you're still acting that way as an adult.
Yeah, it's almost better if they are sort of in that committed couplet though, versus a Rick in Knight of Cups,
Mm.
or I mean song to song and all of that web weaving. Which, by the way, speaking of Lynch and Knight of Cups, I found out today. I wouldn't have known this when I watched it because I had not seen Twin Peaks when I watched it, but they quote Twin Peaks in Knight of Cups. They don't
Wow.
quote it per se, but they play the recording from Twin Peaks of Major Briggs telling his son Bobby about his dream. And so I looked up
Wow.
the scene and I was like, wow, it's kind of a perfect scene to intercut in there, but also just extremely weird to just have
And
that.
why? Like, what? I wonder.
I mean, just the maybe just the dreamlike nature of the whole movie, Knight of Cups, and the fact that he was telling this dream, but the dream that Briggs talks about is of a kind of reaching this kind of nirvana,
Mm.
this hopeful end that they will meet in spite of everything. So that was
That's
kind of cool to
certainly
find out.
also a common thread between his movies. Like, kind of beginning with Badlands actually is apropos because I feel like the thread of looking for a woman to complete a man is like constant beginning to end. Like, every
Mm-hmm.
single film has a very strong in love couple. And I mean, it feels extremely autobiographical to me because I don't know what else he would be speaking out of.
Yeah, it's got to be. And I like to think of Badlands as like the very mythic version of his autobiography, whereas later he just got more. It was kind of exactly like this.
Exactly like this, like To the Wonder, I rewatched this morning and I was like, okay, and I even read about it. I mean, he was literally in this situation
Yeah,
with two women, or at least, caught sort of, and then felt that the love of his life had escaped him. And so it has that force and veracity to it that I don't think can be faked.
that's right. I really think of Tree of Life, To the Wonder, and Knight of Cups as the autobiographical trilogy.
Mm,
When I think about it, following, his childhood, of course, and his early career and early loves, working in drilling and traveling overseas, and then, his work in around surrounded in the film industry and all that may have brought with it. I think that in my head is the trilogy.
well, and I think I either saw or read an interview where Brad Pitt was saying that he felt that he wasn't playing a father in Tree of Life, he was playing Terry's father. Uh, and then he also had a
He was
brother who
playing a
died.
lot of our fathers.
Yes, but I think he himself, the way that he felt that it was being done, it was like, no, I am his father, even though it's relatable to people who can recognize their father in his character. But
Yeah,
I think you're right. That is a reflection of experience, not just a story or a
no
fable,
doubt.
as
Yeah,
we get with Coppola's thing.
the level of details that he put in the father son relationship was just uncanny. Like the way he kind of
Mm-hmm.
grabs the back of his neck as they walk, and
Yeah.
the dinner table sequences, all
Oh,
just so he just nailed it. So he
Yeah.
had to have experienced it to imbue it with that much nuanced realism.
Well, and I wonder, what do you think about people who equate his visions with pretension? Because it's like Tree of Life, especially, it's like, we're having this like very small family in Texas and then juxtaposing it to the creation of the world, putting it on this grand level of significance. And I think a lot of people who maybe aren't religious would think that that's conflating our value in the grand scheme of things. But obviously, Malick is coming from it in a very intentional way to demonstrate it that way. But I think a lot of people just think it's pretentious or write it off as indulgent.
Yeah, and you alluded to some of that in your song to song review, I think. But I have a couple of thoughts on your question. The first being, I don't think, given the quote from Job that he opens with, I don't think
Yes.
he's equating the value of his experience with creation and everything. I think he's juxtaposing them in opposition to say, you only have your own experience, and you're going to have all of these questions, and you're not going to have answers. But what you need to recognize is, I laid the foundations of the earth. I think of Job as the linchpin of the whole Holy Bible, because it does spell out that ultimate perspective versus the limited perspective, and how the limited perspective always has to be in deference to the ultimate perspective, just by virtue of the perspective. There's those last 3 chapters in Job, I mean, just besides being extremely beautiful, saying, how small are you in all this? How can you presume to have a definite opinion, or to adjudicate any of this from your minuscule vantage point? So I think that's part of it. But then the other thing I think is, you talked about your dream and opening up with a voiceover. There's this instinct in us to think of things as, how to say, like everything's a meme, right? When we parodize everything or satirize everything, and I'm incurably sardonic, but that is it probably has its place, and it has rhetorical value, and it's humorous, and it has social effectiveness. But when we do that all of the time, when we're more inclined to write something off as pretentious than we are to actually engage it as an actual way someone can feel. And I just did it earlier, talking about these great love stories. It's just this melodrama or this diluted drama, and not realizing that's an actual experience someone's having. There's a different way to engage it. You can believe someone, you can take them at face value. It's very hard to do at this time. I don't know if any of that made sense.
No, it's great. And I think that it's interesting to me because what you said about Job, and I know that that's exactly how the movie opens. Like, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? But I don't know. I feel when I watch Tree of Life that the juxtaposition is not an opposition. It's actually saying, it's more along the lines of like, I knit you together in your mother's womb, and I know all the strands on your head. That it leans me more towards the sacredness and the value of the individual and the value of the creation as coming out of this cosmic event, rather than saying, who are you in the midst of this? Because there's some films I watch that give me a sense of smallness, like Memoria, where you feel like, oh my gosh, there's this whole huge world and who am I in it? But Tree of Life actually does the opposite for me.
That makes sense, and that's a more righteous inclination. What I think is I can't get to the question, who am I that you are mindful of me, unless I realize how unworthy I am to be made a mind of. And so when I see that distinction, that's when the personal value that every person has comes into full focus for me.
Okay, so beginning with humility, which is obviously that's everything. That's the place to begin, right? The place of powerlessness is where the journey starts.
Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Yeah,
I am nothing, and not only I am nothing, but like I need you and I need help and I cannot do this on my own. It also, as much as it is Job, it's also Jonah to me in a way, which I feel like Jonah combines both things that we're talking about. It combines the, like, this is a rebellious, selfish person who doesn't deserve to be used for God. But then also, this is actually who God wants to use and goes to great lengths to not only, he's showing him in dramatic fashion so that Jonah can actually choose to go in the way. And Jonah, I don't think, comes to any point where he's like, I wonder why God did this for me. I'm not that great. But it's kind of both of those elements of like the unworthiness being very apparent, and then the choosing this particular person to do this great thing is also there.
That's good. That's really good. And I think Jonah shows up in a lot of these. I think of Jonah when I watch Thin Red Line, and I think of Jonah in Knight of Cups, and just that runaway messenger that ends up becoming, because Jesus, didn't he say, I won't give you any sign but the sign of Jonah? It's like his small story serves as the sign, the image for the sign of Christ's lordship. That's really good to bring up Jonah,
I think you're right in the wandering way too. The resistance. It's Knight of Cups to me is so profound because there's this tremendous resistance to open oneself into any unfamiliar avenues, but the longing is so strong that it's impossible to shake. So it's this weird mixture of like, you always hope in life that people get to the point where they're willing to shed familiarity and go in a different way. But most people don't do that. They keep on searching in their familiar environments, even though there's this feeling that what they need isn't there because it's frightening, right? So you always hope that something will, you'll get eaten by a whale and then you will have to reassess your environment. But sometimes that doesn't happen. So Knight of Cups to me is that hesitation to go into any other space than what you know, but being completely bombarded by the desire to find something else.
Oh, that's interesting. I would hear you more on this. So I feel like he's a fish out of water the whole time in Knight of Cups. You think of him as being not knowing what water is because he's so surrounded by it.
Yes.
That's interesting. So Knight of Cups, what's your general verdict on it there in terms of overall appraisal?
I think that it's like Shame, where you end and you hope that the thing that they're doing is the last time they'll do it. Like you hope that they realize that something isn't working and that's the thing that isn't working, and they put it to rest. Like the girl at the end where you're like, you hope that it's the last of that type of relationship for him, but I don't really know. I hope that.
Oof. That's the only one I saw in theaters, by the way. And I'm not sure if that colored how much I loved it, or if it was just the time of life and feeling that aimlessness and digging a hole you can't crawl out of experience. And just having these whispers, these constant whispers in your mind of to remember who you are, or and balancing that with the hopelessness of maybe you never were that. And I don't know, everything about that movie just, I felt, maybe it's because it interacts so much with these great stories like the prodigal son or the Pilgrim's
I was going to say
Progress.
that.
I mean, it's timeless in that way, but it's not easy. It's not easy to, you can intellectually assent to what's valuable, and then nothing in your life speaks to that belief whatsoever. Man, this movie is impossible to talk about for me, which is a bad position to be in right now.
When you're on a podcast. You know what, though? I will say this. One thing I do notice that sort of is a differentiator for me between like a 5-star and a 4-star a lot of times is if a movie is asking all the right questions, right? And you can feel the authenticity of the yearning and the aimlessness, like you said, and the incomplete, God-shaped hole thing. But then there's no direction. That's where, to me, it can't transcend. Like Pilgrim's Progress, he has a burden. He feels the burden. He wants to get rid of it. And so he's going to the celestial city. And along the way, he meets people who either tempt him or move him along. But there's this very clear, I know I have a problem. I know exactly what that problem is. The closer I get to the celestial city, the burden becomes lighter, literally. And then he goes there, right? But for Knight of Cups and Song to Song especially, it's like, I don't know what my burden is. I don't know how to get rid of it. I don't know where to go. I can feel it, but I actually don't know what it's made up of. And there's not really a degree of self-reflection that would lead to truth. It's just questions.
Maybe, if you chart the title cards, right, with the tarot conceit, at the end, it replaces a card from the deck, which I think is judgment after death. And instead of going to judgment, it goes to freedom, right? And so I do think that there's an angle in that movie of that has a little better sense of direction. What I think he just doesn't have it in him to crawl up out of it at that moment. But there's this recognition of how he's living essentially a double life, knowing what he knows, believing what he believes, but completely swimming upstream of it. And there's so much good fruit. Not so much. There's good fruit in him. It's just very, very faint. There's snatches of forgiveness in him, and there's a care and concern in him that emerges. He doesn't totally become like something more like this Fassbender character in Song to Song that feels completely enslaved. So I feel more hope in Knight of Cups, but I think in Song to Song, that despair really did get to me. The despair of what it was almost like a necessary. You need to spend 2 hours in that, man, because that'll change your life if you just spend a couple hours in it, ruminating over it.
Totally,
unpleasant hours.
I think Song to Song is also an identity crisis. I don't think, like, I see Knight of Cups as more a purpose seeking, and then also relationally, like, how do I love, what is it? What does it look like? But then Song to Song, even though it appears to be all about relationships, it really is about Rooney Mara being completely unable to know herself in any real way, and then lamenting that fact. I think, which one did you compare to Ecclesiastes? And then I think Song to Song you literally said was Song of Songs, but I think Knight of Cups, did you say, was like
Exactly,
Ecclesiastes?
yeah. Because
Okay.
those 12 chapters I'm exploring everything there is on offer, and I'm coming up
Mm-hmm.
short. And then Song to Song being pretty much an anti-Song of Songs, an anti-Song of
That's
Solomon.
how I feel.
Yeah.
Right.
The total inversion.
Even though it's like characterized by constant romance and people getting together and everyone's so beautiful and willing, but there's just no satisfaction anywhere.
Yeah, and I haven't done a deep dive on Song of Songs in a while, but thinking about the constancy of the erotic experiences of love that are in Song to Song, and the multiplicity versus the very deliberated process that you see in Song of Solomon, of not awakening love before it's time, to just choose a famous one, but there being this very deliberate kind of path towards one another, and then there just being one another. They're really two sides. That's not the right expression to use here. They're just complete opposites, is what it is.
Right. And that has to be deliberate because of the title, even though it
went
goes
through
with
a couple
the music
titles though too. But yeah,
okay.
I agree with you entirely. I think that replacing that preposition is just like,
yeah, right. I also think, speaking of the titles and the meanings, Thin Red Line, I that was my favorite Malick that I watched, and I was just completely blown away. I was crying my eyes out the whole time. I was so affected by it. It was
remarkable.
A little bit strange. I know, it was strange. And then afterwards, my dad was like, "So what's the thin red line?" And I didn't know.
The thin red line of courage.
Okay, well, so I looked it up, and it's based on a book, and so the book was called The Thin Red Line.
Oh, really? Oh, the book.
No.
Oh, I see. I follow you.
But you're right.
It was an adaptation.
That the book, the title, The Thin Red Line, was based off a Kipling poem called Tommy about a soldier, and it's a very good poem.
Yeah, it's a weird poem.
It's a weird poem, but it has a lot of good energy in it, where you can just feel it. You know, it's kind of kinetic. But anyway, so there was also this thing like there's a thin line between the sane and the mad.
Okay.
And so what you said about Song to Song and that it's an inverse and there's two sides, I don't know if I've thought about this enough to say, but it seems like he always has opposites at play. Like Tree of Life would be nature versus grace. Like it seems like there's a clear this against this, which one wins thread, even if it's just like, is she going to end up with Fassbender or Gosling or whatever? There's always like, it seems like two
that's good
choices.
Yeah. I think that's right. And you think it's madness and insanity in...
Well, certainly in Thin Red Line, right? And then it's also...
I thought of courage and cowardice.
Courage and cowardice.
And I wonder how related those are by way of analogy. But Thin Red Line. So I want to hear more about why that was your favorite.
Do you like it?
Yeah. Well, I love every Malick movie, but it is a lower ranking one for me.
Okay.
And it was the second one I saw, I think. So I don't know if I was expecting more of Tree of Life. And it was not unlike it in many respects. Maybe the ability to connect with soldiers was hard for me.
It should be hard for me, Mitch. I mean,
well, there's something elemental there, and I always feel incomplete as a person because I wasn't a soldier. But maybe that's some weird masculine kind of...
No, I get it. That's I'm sure there's like something very like primal maybe there.
Shakespeare's 7 Stages of Man. I skipped that one.
Yeah, like there's something. Well, first of all, I love Saving Private Ryan. That's been one of my favorite movies for forever, since I was a kid. And this reminded me a bit of that. But it's also just, I loved how it went from character to character, but with such depth
Hmm.
in a, like some characters are only in there for one scene or two scenes, and I felt I knew them. I felt like what was most important to be conveyed to know a person is repeatedly done throughout the film.
Hmm.
I loved like the different narrations and the different perspectives. The actors were also just, I feel like everyone was top of game too. John Cusack especially, and he's not in it for very long, but I don't know. It was just, I felt everything that people were saying.
Yeah, I like I really, what sticks out to me, and it's been a decade, but what sticks out to me is the back and forth between Penn and it's Caviezel,
Caviezel,
right?
me too.
Like
Right.
there's nothing else, you know. There's not another world. Um, there's no use in going into this burning building, you know, trying to save people. Like all that's compelling, and I mean that sticks around. There's nothing else after this line. Even in I think in Knight of Cups, I think the way they put it, and maybe it's not even in the same type of conversation, but there's nobody home. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
just this nihilism kind of strain.
Right. Well, and I think after Jim Caviezel, well, spoiler alert, after he dies in Thin Red Line, Sean Penn stands at his grave and he says, "Where's your spark now?" And he's, as he says it, he's very sad, like he just breaks down and cries. But it's that same thing of like that Caviezel is saying, the spark never dies, basically. Like when I die, I will continue on in another life. And Sean Penn seems to end with the cynicism and not having changed at all or listened to anything he said, which is one choice to go about it. I almost respect just
Oof.
the
He's
realism of it.
I thought of him as the Jonah character because he went AWOL, right, Caviezel?
Caviezel went AWOL.
And
Mm-hmm.
if he's the Jonah character, I mean, then I guess in some ways he's the Christ character, especially given that end you just described as the and then what do you do with that person's death? But it especially so they talked about his death, and you're saying Caviezel talks about how the spark won't die even if I die. I mean, that's very powerful stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And what you do with Christ's death is very in that conversation. Um,
Well, this is kind of the Harry Potter conversation too of that the best and most powerful narratives are always infused with a resurrection component, always.
mm-hmm.
And we are, I think, as humanity, are very moved by like coming back from the dead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, is there? I'm. If I think about that, I get very hopeless. If I think about there not being a resurrection, I get extremely hopeless, and I don't know how other people handle this. But I mean, if this is it, I mean, there's a lot of beautiful things in the world, but man, there's so much ugly. And if that's it, you know, and I've got a good life, and some people just suffer start to finish. And it's just like, man, is that it? Can't be it. So,
Right. The whole thing about like that the gospel hinges on the resurrection is very true. I think that if it ends there, and this is sort of the question of last temptation of Christ that I think Schrader was asking was, you know, if Jesus just decided to say, never mind, I'm going to just live a good life, the difference between those two things is just so drastic. I mean, it's monumental. It's unclassifiable how different that is. So you're right. If we cannot be redeemed and we cannot ourselves come back from the dead, then what is the point? I don't see the meaning without the coming back. If Harry just goes on the train, you know, because Dumbledore's like, if you want to just go on this train, you don't have to go back and fight the evil. Then it's like, that's just nothing.
oof, yeah. I see that, and I see that in the. That's why I think the fact that he's telling these romantic stories over and over again, these stories between couples, is gunning for, because I think the breaking off of what is it? Paul writes about a man and a woman becoming one flesh, and he says this is a great mystery, and then he essentially says this is to image Christ in his church. And so when you see that fracture, it's like it's giving you an image of is giving you a last temptation every time you see that fracture, because it's what if Christ decided not to get on the cross?
Yeah.
That's really cool. The romantic, the marriage story is like the story of everything. Any marriage story is like a story of everything. And it's funny though, because Malick isn't often dealing in marriages, per se, right?
Right.
He's
Hidden life.
Hidden life is that's true.
That's I think this maybe the strongest one besides Tree of Life.
Yeah.
But Hidden Life is like a good marriage that's sustaining and life-giving and faithful and all of those things. You know, I think that's his probably strongest representation of how that can give you courage.
Yeah. I wonder if it then goes on to be the kind of heightened image that we're talking about here. I think and that's why I say per se, because look, in Badlands, I mean, I'm not a theologian. I'm not going to pretend to sit here and define marriage, but you know, we could speculate about that for a long time. But in Badlands, when she gets in the car with them after they've burned the house down, and she got her school bugs, and she's like, I felt my destiny was tied to him for better and worse. And I was like, I see. You know, theirs is a marriage. And so all of these romantic relationships are creating an image, you know, whether it's a good one or a negative one.
And I think the negative one, for me at least, I almost didn't like this movie at all because of it, was Days of Heaven. I cannot stand the love triangle
I've
deal.
hated love triangles too in movies in general, but that one I really went for. I guess because it was Mitch? Because it was so mapped onto the Genesis stories of Abraham and Isaac, and that's just a weird story, and it happens 3 times.
Right.
To Abraham, 1 Isaac, I think. And maybe they're the same time with Abraham, but I don't think so. But I mean, anyway, the fact that you get that same structure 3 times is very strange. And
so how do you correlate the two? Tell me how do you connect them?
Oh, well, okay. So when in the very beginning of the movie, the narrator, the young girl, says they would tell everybody they were brother and sister.
Yes.
And they go to this guy's kingdom, and this guy in the kingdom takes her as his wife. You know, it's just exactly what the Pharaoh did, and the other guy's name escapes me. I think it's most in line with the Pharaoh though, because you also in the Pharaoh story have a plague that's visited because he takes Abraham's wife. Of course, he doesn't know it, and so he doesn't understand why this is happening to him. And I don't know if they really have a payoff, because I don't know if in the scriptural account there isn't what you would think of as a payoff. It's just a very weird story. And so I was just excited that someone was interacting with it that directly.
It made me think of like David and Bathsheba.
Oh, really?
Yes, because there's like, you know, he wants her just like David did. Mm-hmm. She's married. He doesn't know that. Right. You know, Sam Shepard doesn't know that, but she's with Richard Gere, takes her, and then somebody dies, and that's the same thing there, where there's like tremendous jealousy and rage and like lust and all these just good feelings, good emotions, pure emotions run amok. And so in that regard, I think it's elevated, but the way that the movie comes across to me is very soap opera, whiny, to me. And so I just was so turned off. And it was so jarring to have that kind of story in the grandeur of the imagery.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, why do so many people love this? I don't understand.
Well, look, we are inhabiting many similar such stories in this grand imagery. Like there's a real pettiness that we drift
Yes.
towards, and so to see that, I mean, Gear, I love when he's saying, like, I thought I was gonna have a big score. He's
Right.
just like every other kid on the planet who thought he was the chosen one. And
Mm-hmm.
then he realized that he's given his wife away just to squat on this land for a little longer.
Right. And then it just sort of ends tragically with everyone. And you're like, wow, thanks, Malick. I just like, I, I don't, I guess I didn't understand the takeaway. Like, is it just a story that you read and you're like, okay, thank you for that. But I really was like searching for some sort of, I don't know, unless it's just slice of life, that this is what.
There's got to be more. There's got to be more.
Right?
Um,
I mean, you loved it, Mitch. I think you gave it 5 stars. So
no, surely not. Surely not.
I'm pretty sure you did. But okay, it resonated.
Yeah, no. There's no question about
Yeah.
it. But look, when I said this in Badlands, is really the way that I view Terrence Malick's filmography is very much like the way that I read scripture, and that it doesn't seem to be inviting just a whole lot of moral. It's a very moral book, especially as it progresses. But when it's giving accounts and histories, it kind of does leave you hanging with them, and you're left to wonder. But you do feel it on this kind of visceral level. It's like, why have I been told this story since I was an infant, of this guy that goes into this kingdom, gives away his wife, gets her back? I mean, what is going on here? But it's one of those, it's like, maybe it's like a discipline in and of itself, to meditate over and over again. It's certainly not I don't even remember what they were telling us in Sunday school when they were telling us this story. Like, I think sometimes they'd be like, yeah, see, even Abraham, a godly man, lied or something. But
Or like the scene of he and Isaac, that it was a test and that he was going to kill his son and then he
yeah,
didn't, or like, I mean, some of them have messages that are a little bit more discernible, but
sure.
I did hear David and Bathsheba a couple weeks ago in church, and I was like, this is awful. Like,
It's a
why are
rough
we
story.
reading this?
It's a rough
Yeah,
story.
it is.
But some of them just feel so random.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I can only assume that someday I'll be blindsided by what Days of Heaven has to say to me. But until then, I'm going to keep on mulling over it. I'm going to read and reread it.
I think that this is perhaps something that Malick understands, the nature of, well, not nature, maybe the value of ruminating.
Yeah, maybe.
And just sitting in something, and if you're completely hesitant to doing that, you're going to hate a lot of his movies, if not all of them.
And also, you're going to have a hard time in life. There's a little bit of humility to reproducing that particular story or stories from the Old Testament, because do I have a better story to tell? No. This one stuck around a long time, and a lot of people put a lot of stock in it. And I tell you what, if I've got this camera and a couple million, let's try putting this one up there and see what happens and see what it does. So maybe we can't fully appreciate it. In Matt Zoller Seitz on Night of Cups was kind of trying to be self-aware about his 4-star rating of it. And he was just like, I mean, does the Emperor have no clothes on here? Or, I mean, are we just kidding ourselves with this stuff? But I don't think so. There's too much oomph in it.
Right. And I think that if you sort of allow it to wash over you or challenge you in any way, then you'll start sounding like the characters. The thing with Song to Song and Knight of Cups especially is I'm trying to identify what is our knee-jerk push against things that make us feel vulnerable like that. Like, why, if somebody were talking about, asking these sorts of questions. My favorite question, by the way, is from New World, where he says, who are you whom I so faintly hear? Like, if somebody came up to you, Mitch, and was like, who are you whom I so faintly hear? I mean, I'm pretty sure that you'd be like, there would be this resistance there instead of an inviting, like, maybe you would be inviting, but normal people would be, not normal, but the average person would be like, what are you talking about? I need to do this, this, and this today. I have to go to the store. I have to drop my kid at school, and so we don't have a lot of room for such ponderings. And then I think when we hear them, we judge them as either a waste of time or silly.
I think that's right. As I've gotten older, I've found that I speak abstractly a lot, and I'm sure it's some kind of subconscious defense mechanism, but a lot of times the things I'll say when I'm interacting with people really come across as nonsense, and people have a low tolerance for nonsense, if indeed that's what it is. But I've met a few people in my life who I would say something off the wall, something arbitrary, and they would just immediately engage it. And I found that whenever someone did that I kind of recognized what was at the bottom of the seemingly off the wall thing I was saying, because I started to lose faith in just, do I'm really just walking around speaking compulsively like a lunatic? But if you are willing to engage something that isn't obvious, it's going to be rewarding for everyone, I believe. And so you're right, this heightened language can be written off as pretentious, and that's easy enough to do. But if you just take it at face value, I think people who are willing to do that are going to not only be rewarded themselves, but reward those around them.
I agree. And I think that we have so much time every day to have those types of conversations if we wanted to, because I don't think that everyone is hesitant if it were familiar. Like, if you are in a philosophy class, like I took one in college, we talk about, where does evil come from? What is this within us that moves towards this and that? And then the more that you attend the class, you start talking that way with the people in your class if you see them outside the class. And it becomes an acceptable conversational style. So it could be that we just aren't used to the way of the Spirit in that way, where we're just so focused on the physical and the right now. And so to talk about anything where it's not designated, you're in a philosophy class, so it's okay to say this, is hard, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you say, I mean, you gave the example of just going about daily errands and having things to do. You exist in this very narrow structure. And so the widening of the structure is always kind of tense. Well, that's true with Malick's movies, because they're not the conventional cinematic lane we're used to writing in. I like another thing Seid said, writing for Ebert, that it's of Knight of Cups. He said it's a movie that teaches you how to view it. It's self-interpreting to some extent. And so if you will engage it, it will teach you to do it, even though it's not immediately obvious to you how to do it.
That's perfect segue into, I have only one thing I want to read.
Okay.
Because I don't normally read on this thing. My favorite prayer, because a lot of the things sound like a prayer to me, which I'll get at in a second, because I want to know what you think about this.
And some objectively are.
Yes. There is a prayer, a literal prayer, spoken by a cardinal into the wonder, because the Javier Bardem character is a priest, and he's struggling with his faith, and he's like, where is God? What's the point? Okay, so I wrote down the actual prayer, which goes with how the teaching us how to see. He says, flood our souls with your Spirit, and life so completely that our lives may only be a reflection of yours. Shine through us. Show us how to seek you. We were made to see you. So to me, it's like Malick is trying to show the world and humanity in a way that reformats our vision,
Yes.
our way of seeing. And
Yes.
he's infusing it with existential questions and religious imagery and questions about God and grace and love in a way that you kind of have to put those lenses on.
Mm-hmm. That's exceptionally good. And I think that's exactly right. And seeing is, just talking about it as seeing, although it's probably not literally seeing, is the perfect way to look at it, because we take for granted that everyone can see. We're so used to seeing that it doesn't even occur to us that we might not be able to see. This is the right way to view Malick, for sure. And that's a great prayer. The other great prayer in that movie is the prayer of St. Patrick.
Yes, Christ before me.
This is the first time I heard that was in that movie, and oof.
And that scene is directly after, like, he says, "Where is God?" And then he's serving communion to the prisoners, and they're saying that prayer, and that's it. There's a direct response there of there he is.
Yeah, it's per the when did we feed you? When did we visit you in prison?
Uh-huh.
Oh man,
it's dense. People who write off To the Wonder and the sort of later stuff, I feel like it is what we were just talking about. It is that instinctive, no, this is stupid. These are like very attractive people they shouldn't have any problems because they're rich and there's these beautiful spaces. Why are they complaining? There's all this really shallow judgment that happens at a movie that's accused of being shallow. It's kind of weird.
I've not thought of this, probably not at all, but since you mention it in passing, in some ways it is kind of odd that he stacks, especially these latter-day movies, up with movie stars. In Red Line too. I mean, just what do you think why do you think he's doing that?
Well, I think that everybody wanted to work with him, for one.
Yeah, okay. And
so as it went on, because New World to me is the one that feels the most odd. With like Christopher Plummer and Colin Farrell, it feels a little bit weird because I know them from other things.
Mm-hmm.
But then I kept thinking, well, the more renown he got and how special his movies are and unusual, I think that it attracted A-listers because it's a lot. I mean, a lot of the later movies are just packed, like you said.
But then he welcomes them into this script, surely knowing that there's a possibility of they're distracting from it. Or maybe it's to fill seats, or maybe it's a producer kind of caveat, but I don't think so. I feel maybe he just likes them genuinely.
Colin Farrell tells this my buddy Shaw sent me a bunch of links of interviews, and he tells this really funny story on Hot Ones about being in New World and how Colin Farrell was giving this monologue and he felt like he was doing such good acting and that it was like top of game. And he said they were literally filming, and then all of a sudden Terrence is like, "Oh, look, a bird," and the camera moves to the bird, and he like goes off into the forest and brings like the cameraman with him, and Colin is like, okay. So he was like, I felt insulted, but then I felt wonder at this person. Like it was enamored by the idea. So he's saying he doesn't feel like Malick values characters as much as living in the present moment and being very open to flow and what is actually going on around him, not script. And because Days of Heaven was like years of editing, and it really was made in post. It wasn't made at the time. You know what I mean? Because yeah,
he's completely touched, man. The ability he has to capture and then order
right,
all that he has. I liked A.O. Scott on Voyage of Time wrote that he seems at once what he's seeing. He says seems at once utterly natural and completely impossible. And that's what I felt when I was watching Terrence Malick. I almost thought, like I said on Stalker, I almost thought like I could do this, but then there's no way. This is like a completely divine gift here.
It's like the character in Hidden Life who is the painter in the cathedral. I feel like that's Malick, where he feels that he's just painting beautiful pictures in a cathedral of images that he didn't create in an effort to understand them. Because the painter says something like, I can't draw Christ because I haven't suffered enough.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, that's Malick. Even though the next movie he's going to do is The Way of the Wind about Jesus. Maybe he feels now he's suffered enough.
Yeah.
But it's this interesting thing of like, it's so fascinating what he's searching for and what he's focusing on and what maybe he doesn't feel up to task to illuminate, even as much as people are so moved by the breadth of the images. He probably still feels that it falls short.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So this new movie, The Way of the Wind, is intimidating to think about. I felt uncomfortable when I was watching Voyage of Time because I don't know exactly why, but I felt there was a breadth that he was reaching for that was, it's like these things too wonderful for me. I think it says somewhere, but he's really swinging for the fences, and I'm glad he's doing it.
He's definitely curious and asking the questions.
And he seems to have a good idea maybe of where he's been, and I'm not sure if, say, Hidden Life is somewhere he feels that he is, that he's arrived at, or he's putting the ideal more in focus than to only put it even more in focus in his upcoming movie. He certainly has lived a hidden life in terms of the way he's put himself out there. Although I think when Knight of Cups came out, he gave like a longer form interview. So I don't know how much of that is just kind of gossip. I actually don't have a line on how much press he's done, but certainly less than pretty much anyone I can think of.
Do you think that he, like in the verbiage of like provocateur and somebody who's trying to stir or move, what is your sense from his films that he's trying to get us to see? If he is trying to change the way that we interpret or look at things, what do you think is the intention as far as what we leave with?
The bigger picture, insofar as we can see what it is, insofar as it's been revealed to us, that it transcends the things that we've become accustomed to valuing, the wealth and pleasure, that those two words kind of are in my mind all the time, because I see them as the things that I'm gunning towards. Wealth and pleasure and this sense of worldly success, reputation, that there could be something higher, that there has to be something higher. And if there isn't something higher, then yeah, like we talked about in the beginning or throughout, that there has to be a bigger picture. There has to be something beyond the affairs of mice and men. What do you think?
Well, I think I'm reminded of, from a Christian perspective, obviously, I think the charge to deny yourself, take up your cross, follow me is what I consider the crux of the matter, because those are all things that are so against everything you just said that we actually actively seek for most of our lives. Like dying to self is not something that anybody wants to do, and a lot of people don't even know how to do. And then take up your cross. No one wants to take up their problems and the struggles that they have and really look at them and deal with them, and then follow Christ is huge. So it's almost like whatever you want to say, wealth, pleasure, whatever the opposite of those things is probably what we're supposed to be moving towards. Like service is another form of self-sacrifice, you know?
Yeah, that's right. It's not just it. I guess away from wealth and pleasure, but really towards true wealth and true pleasure.
Right.
That there's, and the only, so he, in Tree of Life, he does imagine a kind of afterlife. Is that the only one he does it in? Maybe that bluntly. In Voyage of Time, he doesn't, to spoil, but it's a very different movie. But that image he creates of, and it's in some ways not totally satisfying, but certainly there's this pure love that's there. There's a total reconciliation relationally between everyone. There's beauty. There's aesthetic beauty everywhere you look, and I think it Christ endures the cross for the joy set before him. That has to be it. There has to be this great
joy beyond the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And a sense of that love covers a multitude of sins, right? That we are there for one another, and that so much of what we're preoccupied with is completely self-centered.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can't remember what book I just read this in, but it was talking about the over-reliance of the self as being our main problem. Dependence is just, healthy dependence. I mean, we're great at being codependent, and we're great at being like financially dependent or whatever kind, but in like true, being dependent in a way because we need it for our own growth is actually a very difficult activity. So a lot of times I think suffering and pain are the only ways in which we will be willing to explore different avenues again. And yeah, denying yourself is sort of the first step to even feeling what that looks like.
Yeah, and the priest says in To the Wonder, you'll love whether you like it or not. And it's also true that you will suffer whether you like it or not, or whether you do everything to avoid it or not. And to then say, well, if I'm going to suffer, it must be for something higher. It must be for something right and good and pure.
This is an interesting conundrum because I just read The Problem of Pain again by C.S. Lewis. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I think I have been changing in my mind about this is because a lot of people say that there's so much suffering that is not good and that you cannot justify, and that no matter how so the only thing I can think of to wrap my brain around it well is that our view of suffering is not God's, that we are literally not able to interpret the results or the experience of anyone else's or even ourselves in the way that he places meaning on that. And that, like, I have to accept that. Otherwise, injustice cannot be reconciled with, or yeah, it's not. We're not able to fully assess it. The Chinese farmer parable. Which one? About the radishes?
No, I'm going to butcher it. But his horse runs away, and his neighbors say, "Oh, that's such bad news," and he says, "We'll see." And it comes back with like 5 other horses, and so on. His son falls off and breaks his arm, but he doesn't have to go to war, and so on. Yes. There's that sense in which, you have to embrace the fact that you can't fully assess the outcomes of the suffering that you or others are experiencing. And then there's the flip side of that, in which you also have to risk saying, oh, this is bad. Like, you can call things bad, you can call things sorrowful, and you can mourn with others. It's life is just completely full of fine lines that we're having to constantly toe. But there's much freedom there too.
And I think hindsight perhaps affords an opportunity to recognize that, like, a lot of times when I'm in the midst of something difficult, I think someday I will look back on this and I will say, I'm glad this happened because of this, or if that hadn't happened, it wouldn't have led to this. And because I know I've done that before, I can do it now, which is it's a helpful present feeling to be able to say, or just imagine or posit to yourself that I could look back on this and say, thank goodness that happened. Because
do you have anything where you look back and you say, I'm not happy that happened all these years later? Sometimes I think, if you put the button right in front of me, I would smash it. I'd go back.
It's a redo Groundhog Day.
But that's why I'm not God, I guess.
Well, but among also, Mitch, the other thing, though, is that you don't know, like, this is kind of Back to the Future territory. You don't know what, if you push the button on one thing, you don't know what other things you wouldn't have.
No,
Peggy Sue Got Married
you have a limited
is a perfect example. Yes, like the whole moral of Peggy Sue, which I think is very interesting, is that she goes back in time. She's like, I'm not going to be with Nick Cage. He ruined my life. He cheated on me. He's such an asshole. And then she realizes that she wouldn't have her children if she weren't with Nick Cage. And so she has to be with him. So she literally goes back in time to change her life and changes nothing about her life. And that's the lesson, that if you actually had the opportunity, you probably wouldn't do it, because it would create a series of other events that are not your good life that you have.
That's right. It's just, my big hang up is knowing you can't assess. I know nothing but that I know nothing. And then still having to know things and behave. But no, good thing we can't change the past anyway. You've got the right outlook when suffering comes to try to begin to imagine or to recognize that in the past, when suffering has come, it's produced a positive result.
And that hopefully we get to a place of maturity where maybe our decisions are wiser. Mm-hmm. And so we prevent perhaps some future harm that we didn't in the past. I think that's sort of the way to merge the, how do we say, like, I don't know anything and I know that I don't know anything, but then also that I need to do things and I need to live. And I think the way to do that is to say that you hope that you grow, not that you hope that everything's perfect.
Yeah. And with suffering, not only the perspective that you have in and of yourself, seeing there be a kind of payoff, but looking around, whenever I'm called upon to suffer, I generally, try to think, for somebody, this is probably easy. For somebody, this is probably nothing. No, it's not just to say, like, oh, other people have it worse. To whatever extent that could even be helpful, I don't know. I'm sure it varies. But for someone, this probably isn't even a challenge. It would be. And so why can't it be that way for me? But that's not really a full embrace of the suffering. Like, suffering is actually suffering. It's not as though you it's easy to talk about pain from this perspective, but when you're in pain, it's like, oh yeah, that's pain.
I know.
That hurts. And I don't know about this burden being easy or light business. I don't fully understand that.
I'll say this. I was in a meeting the other day and somebody was saying that when they first got sober, mm-hmm. they said to God, why me? Mm-hmm. Like, why did I have an abusive dad? And why did I do this? And then my life unfolded like this way. Why me? And she said she was telling this to her sponsor. And her sponsor said, why not you? And And I've been thinking about that a lot, where it's like, it's not an invitation to be down on yourself or to think that you deserve bad things to happen to you or misfortune. But it is back to that humility you were talking about, where you say, why shouldn't things happen to me? And I think there's almost a piece about that. Like if getting like a terrible diagnosis, or like maybe thinking like, why not me, is actually useful, so that you know that like you're not higher than anybody else and God's not partial to you.
Yeah, that is helpful. And maybe one final note on suffering. Doesn't have to be the final. Don't know why I said that, but
that's fine.
Um,
Go for it, Mitch.
There is this paradigm of a progression of how suffering unfolds in Paul's letter to the Romans, about suffering producing perseverance, and perseverance producing character, and character producing hope, and that hope will not put you to shame. So it's not unlike the way you figured it, but if you don't have the benefit of retrospect and you just have the gift of amazing faith, then maybe you can recognize that, you will be more capable after this, both in matters of endurance and matters of personal moral fiber, and just to have hope is the greatest thing in the world.
I agree. And I definitely, from any sort of suffering that I've gone through in my life, I have felt that way about it. I have felt that the challenge was sharpening, and I'm actually grateful for it, because it means that I'm not stuck. Like without suffering, we're just doomed to be the same, and not really. But it's hard to say these things, because then someone's like, okay, well, my mom has cancer. Do you want to go to the hospital and tell her that
that's the other thing?
Suffering, so but I think that these things are Malick worthy. These are the sorts of things that are important to ask, even if you feel completely out of your element, Donnie, You
need to go here, because whether you go into this line of thinking or not, suffering will come. And it seems better to have gone into this line of thinking. I feel squeamish in another way too. The example you gave for squeamishness is a good one, but I feel like almost all of my suffering has been brought on by myself. There's this
I understand, right?
line about, if you suffer for your own sinfulness, then okay. But if you suffer for righteousness, that's the way. And I just have never suffered for the latter.
I understand. That's probably what a first world problem. That's a hard thing to grapple with. There's a lot of stuff that gets into, like, when I write about women or how women are represented, I feel that squeamishness. That's a good word for it, where you're like, who am I to say anything about this? Even if, like, I feel like even if I were suffering in a sort of grand scale way, I still don't feel that sort of boldness to just be matter of fact about the matter. I think maybe that's good that we are kind of shy about it almost, or that we don't feel we're up to all that would be required to speak very strongly on the matter.
Mm-hmm. Got to maintain the squeamishness then.
You maintain the squeamishness. Yeah. Well, Mitch, this has been wonderful. I hope that we did this filmography justice. If you could recommend one Malick film to someone who has never seen them, what would you do? What would you say is a good entry?
The Tree of Life. My hands are tied.
Okay. So that is the end all be all for you, which you have not written about and you won't write about?
I don't think I can.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that we got you to talk about it, because...
Yeah, thanks. I love doing this. Very fulfilling.
Yes. Thank you very much. And I hope that the way of the wind is what I imagine it will be, like a a culmination of all these things at the height of itself. We may have to get back together just for a quick discussion on The Way of the Wind when it comes back. That'd be great.
I would love that.
Yeah. With that, thank you, Mitch. And we'll see you at the movies.